Female loneliness has now become a global crisis. One shocking number cuts through everything right now. Millions of women across China and the United States have reached middle age with no husband, no children, no savings, and no plan for who will care for them when health fails or money runs out. That is the core truth staring everyone in the face today. And it is only getting worse as economic pressure builds toward 2026. What you are about to hear lays out exactly how this crisis unfolded, why men have walked away for good, and what the coming years will actually look like when the safety nets women counted on start to tear. Stay with me until the end, because the final picture is not what most people expect, and ignoring it will not make it go away. If you're enjoying these angry guy videos and want to show some real support, head over to the link in the description and buy me a Red Bull with a one-time gift or set up a monthly pledge. It helps keep the straight talk coming without any filters. Female loneliness has turned into a full-blown crisis that nobody in power wants to name directly, but the evidence piles up every single day if you look without the usual spin. In China, entire generations of women who bought into the idea of staying single and independent for career or personal freedom now face the hard landing when that freedom leaves them isolated in hospitals or empty apartments with aging parents who cannot help forever. The same pattern shows up strong in the United States, where surveys keep revealing that large numbers of women in their 40s and beyond report deep isolation, financial strain, and the sudden realization that the support systems they assumed would always be there simply are not showing up anymore. These are not rare stories anymore. They appear in viral clips where grown women break down, explaining they cannot cover rent, cannot afford basic food, and have no family network left to lean on because the choices made years earlier cut those ties one by one. The independence message, sold hard for decades, promised empowerment and self sufficiency. Yet the result for many has been a slow erosion of the very connections that humans need to survive tough times. Think about it like this: for most of history, people formed families and communities out of necessity because life was unpredictable, and one person alone could not handle illness, injury, or economic downturns. Modern culture told women they could skip that step entirely and still thrive, and a lot of them listened. Now the bill comes due, and the numbers do not lie. Reports from recent years show loneliness rates climbing across adult populations, with particular spikes among those who never married or had children. And the emotional and practical fallout hits hardest when health or money gets tight. Men, on the other hand, have been watching this play out, and many have made deliberate decisions to step back, plan their own futures, and stop pouring resources into situations that offered no real reciprocity. Plenty of regular guys have quietly built up savings, learned skills for self reliance, and in growing numbers, looked overseas for partners who still value traditional roles of being a wife and building a home together. These foreign women often come from backgrounds where family stability matters more than proving a point about independence, where feminine traits get appreciated instead of mocked, and where the daily dynamic does not revolve around constant tests or public complaints about men in general. The contrast could not be clearer. Western and westernized women in places like America and parts of China spent years broadcasting messages that men were optional, that traditional marriage was oppressive, and that women could have it all without compromise. When reality hit and the solo path turned cold and expensive, some of those same voices started shifting toward asking where all the good men went or why nobody steps up to help. The problem is that men already heard the earlier message loud and clear and acted on it by simply moving on with their lives. They found peace in focusing on personal goals, hobbies, fitness, or even relocating to places where the social environment feels less hostile. This is not some temporary sulk. It is a sustained choice rooted in years of observing patterns that showed little upside and plenty of downside for continued investment. The stories coming out of social media platforms paint a consistent picture that feels almost scripted at this point. Women in their 30s and 40s post videos crying about mounting bills, health scares with no one to drive them to appointments, or the fear of growing older without a partner who can share the load. Some openly admit they need a man to step in and provide stability after years of pushing the narrative that men were the root of every problem. The shift in tone is noticeable, but it lands too late for a lot of them because trust once broken does not rebuild overnight, especially when the earlier behavior included open contempt, public shaming, or legal advantages used without hesitation. Men saw the pattern repeat across countless examples. A guy works hard, provides, stays loyal, and still ends up labeled toxic or disposable the moment convenience shifts. False accusations, exaggerated claims and disputes, or casual physical aggression, followed by expectations that he absorb it without response. These things added up over time until the collective male response became a quiet but firm exit from the game. It is like watching someone burn bridges one after another and then act surprised when no one crosses the river to help anymore. What makes the situation particularly sobering is how long the warning signs were visible yet largely dismissed. For decades, the cultural conversation pushed the idea that men needed fixing, that their natural traits were problems to be managed, and that women held the moral high ground in every disagreement. Schools, media, and policy all reinforced versions of this view until it became background noise that most people stopped questioning. Boys learned early to apologize for existing in certain spaces or for showing natural competitiveness. Men in relationships learned to walk on eggshells to avoid accusations that could destroy careers or reputations with minimal evidence. The result was not a more harmonious society. It was growing resentment held in check by social pressure and legal consequences. Men did not suddenly become lazy or afraid. They simply stopped volunteering for roles that offered criticism, risk, and little genuine appreciation in return. The data on marriage rates, birth rates, and male participation in traditional provider paths all tell the same story of disengagement. When the cost benefit analysis no longer adds up, rational people adjust their behavior, and that is exactly what happened on a wide scale. Now, layer on the economic reality that everyone feels tightening around them. Hard times are not coming. They are already here in the form of rising costs, stagnant wages for many, and warnings from financial analysts about bigger disruptions ahead in 2026. Housing, healthcare, and daily essentials keep getting more expensive, while job security in certain sectors feels shaky. For women who built lives assuming government support, community sympathy, or future male rescue would always be available, this creates a double blow. The independence they celebrated leaves them exposed when those external supports weaken. Single women without children or strong family ties face higher risks of poverty in later years because there is no second income, no shared savings, and often no one to help with caregiving when parents age or personal health declines. Stories emerge of women in China sitting alone in hospital rooms, realizing the friends they once had drifted away after those friends started families of their own. Similar patterns appear in American data, where middle aged, unmarried individuals report higher isolation and stress levels tied directly to lack of close relationships. The freedom to live without compromise sounds empowering in theory, but in practice, it often translates to handling every crisis solo while watching peers with partners navigate the same challenges together. Men have responded to the same economic pressure by doubling down on self protection. They cut unnecessary expenses, invest in skills that travel well, and in many cases, explore opportunities abroad where the dollar or equivalent currency stretches further and the social dynamics feel less combative. The passport broas trend is not some fringe fantasy. It reflects a practical calculation that certain cultures still produce women who approach partnership with cooperation rather than competition baked in from the start. These women tend to value providers who show stability, and they bring traits like friendliness, fitness emphasis, and a willingness to build rather than tear down. For a man tired of constant negotiation or public narratives that paint him as the villain by default, this option looks like sanity restored. It is not hatred driving the choice, it is exhaustion from a system that demanded endless giving while returning diminishing respect. The men who make this move often report lower stress, clearer purpose, and relationships that feel reciprocal instead of adversarial. Back home, the fallout continues to unfold in plain sight. Social media fills with accounts of women hitting emotional walls and voicing frustrations that circle back to the absence of male commitment. The same voices that once celebrated smashing traditional roles now lament the lack of men willing to play those roles. This creates a strange loop where demands for accountability from men increase even as the earlier actions eroded the foundation for that accountability. Men hear it and respond with the only leverage they truly control, which is their time, energy, and resources. They say no to situations that feel one sided. They prioritize their own peace and long term security. Some retreat into solitary hobbies or digital worlds where interactions stay low risk. Others focus intensely on career or physical improvement without the distraction of dating drama. The common thread is a deliberate withdrawal from the expectation that men will always absorb the costs of societal experiments in gender relations. The deeper issue here goes beyond individual choices and touches on what happens when large groups of men collectively disengage from core societal functions. Throughout history, societies relied on male participation in protection, provision, and infrastructure building to function smoothly. When that participation drops because the incentives vanish, cracks appear everywhere. Recruitment for demanding or dangerous jobs slows. Family formation rates fall below replacement levels. Innovation and risk taking in certain areas taper off as men conserve energy for personal survival rather than collective advancement. This is not theoretical. Observable trends in workforce data, military enlistment numbers, and marriage statistics all point in the same direction. Women who counted on men to step up regardless of treatment now face the reality that restraint and cooperation were never infinite resources. They were choices made under specific conditions, and those conditions have changed. What adds real weight to this moment is the growing sense that the cultural pendulum has swung as far as it can without consequences. For 50 years, the dominant narrative framed men as needing constant correction while positioning women as perpetual victims deserving endless accommodations. Policies, entertainment, and education reflected this imbalance until it became self reinforcing. Men absorbed the messaging, adjusted their behavior to avoid conflict, and in many cases, internalized a version of themselves as secondary or problematic. The problem with any system built on one sided pressure is that it eventually breeds pushback when the pressure exceeds tolerance. Men are not plotting some grand revenge. They are simply opting out in large enough numbers that the absence becomes impossible to ignore. The women left navigating solo lives in expensive cities or facing health scares without support networks start to feel the practical weight of decisions that once seemed abstract and empowering. Consider the hospital story that circulates from China as one clear example among many. A woman in her 40s sits alone, dealing with a medical issue, and breaks down because there is no partner or child to call for help, no close friends available because life paths diverged years earlier, and the independence she once prized now feels like isolation amplified by circumstance. Similar accounts surface in Western contexts where Single women in middle age describe the quiet panic of realizing retirement savings fall short, caregiving responsibilities for parents fall entirely on them, and the romantic market offers few serious options for men who have already checked out. The pattern recognition here is brutal but honest. When large numbers of women delay or avoid family formation in favor of career or self exploration without building alternative support structures, the later years expose the gaps. Biology and economics do not negotiate with ideology. They enforce limits regardless of how loudly the messaging claims otherwise. Men planning ahead look at the same realities and make different calculations. They see the rising cost of living, the legal risks in certain relationship dynamics, and the cultural climate that treats male success as suspect rather than admirable. Instead of signing up for potential future burdens with uncertain returns, they focus on building personal resilience. Savings accounts grow, skills get sharpened. Some explore international options where cultural expectations still align with mutual benefit rather than ongoing score settling. The foreign women they meet often come from environments where family roles provide clear value and where feminine presentation pairs with practical homemaking without the overlay of resentment. These matches frequently result in lower conflict and higher satisfaction because both sides enter with compatible goals instead of competing worldviews. It is a straightforward adaptation to observed conditions, not some moral failing on either side, but the outcome leaves Western dating pools thinner and more contentious for those who remain. The sobering part that deserves straight talk is how this disengagement accelerates under economic strain. As 2026 approaches with forecasts of tighter credit, job market shifts, and potential broader instability, the safety nets that many assumed would catch everyone start to look frayed. Government programs face budget pressures. Community support weakens when people tighten their own circles. For women without partners or children, the fallback options narrow quickly. Stories of financial desperation, health crises handled alone, and emotional breakdowns become more common because the solo path has real limits when external conditions turn difficult. Men who prepared by living below their means or developing portable income sources weather the same storms with less panic. They do not owe explanations for prioritizing self preservation after years of being told their role was to provide unconditionally while absorbing criticism. This brings us to the harder edge of the conversation that most avoid. Decades of one sided cultural conditioning created a reservoir of male frustration that stayed contained by social norms, legal consequences, and personal discipline. Men learned to restrain natural responses to disrespect, false claims, or physical provocation because the system heavily penalized any pushback. Women grew accustomed to operating within that imbalance, sometimes pushing boundaries under the assumption that consequences would never materialize. The TikTok era amplified this dynamic with public humiliations, casual mockery, and celebrations of behavior that eroded trust further. Men watched and internalized the lesson that participation carried, increasing risk with decreasing reward. The response was not explosive confrontation in most cases, it was quiet withdrawal, the kind that leaves the other side wondering why the support vanished. Yet the underlying tension remains because human nature does not vanish under cultural pressure. Men possess physical and psychological traits shaped by evolution for protection and competition. Suppressing those traits indefinitely requires constant effort. And when societal structures weaken, that effort becomes harder to sustain. The moment external controls, like reliable law enforcement or social shaming, lose effectiveness, the restraint that looked permanent can shift rapidly. This is not a call for chaos. It is a recognition that actions have limits and that treating one group as perpetual villains while excusing another as perpetual victims eventually strains the social fabric to breaking. Women who leveraged state mechanisms or public sympathy to maintain advantage may discover those mechanisms weaken when budgets tighten and public mood shifts. The boy who cried wolf analogy fits because repeated claims without grounding eventually erode credibility. But here, the added layer is decades of active punishment for male existence itself. Pattern recognition kicks in strongly when the same behaviors repeat across time and place. Men increasingly view interactions through a lens that expects certain outcomes based on history rather than hope based on promises. The black pill perspective gaining traction among some men concludes that fundamental differences in behavior and priorities make broad compatibility rare under current conditions. This is not universal hatred. It is cold assessment drawn from repeated observations of outcomes in dating, divorce, and public discourse. When women as a group receive messaging that frames men as obstacles or oppressors while demanding resources and protection from those same men, the logical endpoint is mutual distrust. The era of victim status providing cover for unaccountable actions appears to be closing as economic realities force harder choices. Those who position themselves as needing rescue after contributing to the conditions that required rescue face a reckoning that ideology cannot soften. Kevin Samuels used to warn that winter was coming for certain mindsets, and the metaphor lands heavier now. Hard economic times test every assumption about self sufficiency and social support. For women who embrace messages of total independence without building robust personal networks or financial buffers, the cold sets in faster. Consequences arrive not as abstract punishment, but as practical shortages of care, companionship, and stability. The confrontation that has brewed quietly for decades does not require organized action to manifest. It shows up as mass opting out, reduced birth rates, shrinking marriage pools, and men redirecting energy away from traditional family roles. Without the steady provision and protection that men once offered as default, the autonomy women claimed starts to reveal its true cost in isolation and vulnerability. Women truly opened a set of challenges that extend far beyond individual regret. The legal and social advancements of the last century relied on a stable society where men participated willingly. When that participation erodes, the foundations supporting those advancements weaken as well. Falling back to harsher living standards becomes possible when cooperation breaks down and resources grow scarce. Grandmothers and great grandmothers often operated within cultural frameworks that emphasized family interdependence, which provided built in safety nets even during difficult eras. Modern shifts discarded those frameworks in favor of individual maximization, leaving gaps that no amount of rhetoric can fill when reality demands practical solutions. The can of worms here involves not just personal loneliness, but broader societal rebalancing that could reset expectations around gender roles for generations. Men have reached a point where the word no carries real weight. No to unfair risks in relationships, no to providing without reciprocity, no to absorbing endless criticism while expected to perform regardless. This is not immaturity, it is boundary setting after prolonged imbalance. In 2026, as economic pressures mount, that boundary becomes even firmer because survival instincts prioritize self and immediate circle over abstract social contracts that no longer deliver. The fury held in check for years does not disappear. It redirects into disengagement that leaves systems understaffed and relationships unformed. When women can no longer rely on automatic male response or institutional backup, The dynamic shifts toward raw accountability, where actions meet direct outcomes instead of buffered excuses. The pitiful aspect of the current downfall lies in how preventable much of it appears in hindsight. Clear data on loneliness trends, marriage decline, and financial vulnerability among single populations existed for years. Stories of isolation in hospitals or financial desperation circulated widely, yet the dominant response remained doubling down on the same messages that contributed to the problem rather than honest reassessment. Men observed this and chose paths that protected their own futures. Some stayed single and content. Others built strong male friendships or focused on mastery in chosen fields. The overseas route appealed to those seeking partnership without the cultural baggage, leading to matches with women raised to value family contribution and feminine cooperation. The contrast with domestic experiences where berating, exaggeration, or legal leverage featured prominently could not be starker. Peace and solitude or selective pairing abroad beats repeated cycles of conflict and disappointment. This reality check needs to sink in without the usual deflections. Women facing poverty, health scares, and middle age without support structures are living the consequences of collective choices amplified by cultural encouragement. The tears on social media reflect genuine pain, but they also highlight the gap between promised outcomes and actual results. Men who walked away did not do so lightly. They reached the decision after patterns of disrespect, false narratives, and one sided demands made continued engagement feel like self sabotage. The state that once amplified certain privileges now faces its own fiscal limits, reducing the buffer that allowed imbalances to persist. Simps who enable dynamics through unconditional defense often prove unreliable when real pressure hits because their stance relied on social approval rather than conviction. When those protections fade, the raw dynamics of human interaction reassert themselves without the filters. The coming years will test how societies handle this rebalancing. Economic meltdown forecasts add urgency because scarcity sharpens priorities. Men focused on self reliance will navigate with fewer illusions. Women who bet heavily on independence without backups will confront limits that no amount of prior messaging can erase. The black pill lens grows among men because pattern recognition from thousands of individual stories points to consistent outcomes rather than exceptions. Villain and victim roles flip when actions reveal true character over time. The fury that built from decades of demonization does not require dramatic explosion to change the landscape. Quiet mass withdrawal achieves similar disruption by starving systems of willing participants. Story after story illustrates the shift. A woman in her late 30s posts about struggling to afford basics after years of career focus, wondering why stable men seem scarce. Another describes health issues with no family to assist, realizing friends scattered as life stages diverged. In China, the singlehood trend among educated women leads to later regret when social circles shrink and support vanishes. American data echoes with higher loneliness reports among never married adults facing economic headwinds. Men, meanwhile, share accounts of leaving toxic dynamics after public humiliation or repeated boundary violations, choosing solitude or new horizons instead. The engineer who sold everything to live simply represents one extreme of opting out entirely. Passport travelers seeking compatible partners abroad show another practical response. Both reflect the same core calculation that current domestic conditions offer poor returns for high effort. Rhetorically, the question lingers like a slow burn. How did a movement promising liberation deliver widespread isolation and vulnerability instead? The answer lies in ignoring basic human needs for connection, reciprocity, and long term planning. Independence sounds noble until illness or recession exposes the lack of shared burden. Feminism delivered legal gains, but at the cost of relational trust when it framed half the population as inherent problems. Men absorbed the framing, then withdrew when the cost became clear. The result is a generation of women hitting middle age with gaps in support that grow harder to fill. Aging parents cannot substitute for a committed partner. Government aid stretches thin under broader pressures. The solo path that once felt freeing now reveals its isolation when daily survival demands more than one person can sustainably provide. Men planning for care in later years often do so through savings, health routines, or male networks that emphasize self sufficiency. They avoid the trap of expecting rescue because they witness the fragility of that expectation in others. Overseas marriages frequently succeed because the cultural foundation emphasizes duty and complementarity rather than endless negotiation. Foreign women raised with those values bring energy that feels refreshing against the backdrop of domestic entitlement or combativeness. The fit, friendly, and family oriented traits stand out because they align with building rather than deconstructing. This choice is not rejection of all women, it is selection based on compatibility after domestic options repeatedly demonstrated incompatibility. The intensity of the current moment comes from the collision of long brewing social trends with immediate economic warnings. 2026 stands as a potential flashpoint where pressures converge. Men saying no becomes louder when resources tighten and risks heighten. Women facing the consequences of earlier choices encounter a landscape where automatic provision no longer applies. The pent up frustration from years of being painted as villains while expected to act as saviors does not evaporate. It informs decisions to conserve energy for personal domains where returns are clearer. Society as a whole feels the absence through slower progress on collective goals that once relied on broad male buy in. This is the truthful picture without sugarcoating. Female loneliness as crisis stems from choices amplified by cultural forces that downplayed trade offs. Men walking away represents rational adaptation to those same forces. The pitiful downfall narrative is not glee, but observation of predictable outcomes when incentives misalign with human nature. Winter brings consequences for mindsets that ignored reality. Hard times test assumptions, and many will find their preparations insufficient. The confrontation brews not through plots, but through accumulated decisions that reshape participation. Without state or simp buffers, accountability arrives in its raw form, where actions determine outcomes directly. The can of worms opened decades ago now spills into visible chaos. Legal progression for women assumed stable societal cooperation that is eroding. Autonomy without interdependence exposes vulnerabilities that earlier generations mitigated through family structures. Grandmothers operated with different baselines that provided resilience even in scarcity. Modern losses in well being trace back to discarding those baselines for untested ideals. Men recognizing this through pattern recognition adjust accordingly, leading to further divergence. The black pill conclusion that inherent differences make broad harmony difficult under current conditions gains adherence because evidence accumulates daily. Decades of repressed anger bubble beneath surface calm. When the moment arrives where women cannot leverage external controls to manage male response, the dynamic shifts toward direct consequences. Claims of victimhood lose power when villainous patterns become too obvious to ignore. Ruthless treatment follows when deflection replaces accountability. This is not advocacy for harm, but description of natural rebalancing when artificial protections weaken. Women thought privileges were permanent power. They were conditional on societal stability that men helped maintain. As that stability phrase, the conditionality reveals itself. The story unfolds like a long arc in human social experiment. Promises of utopia through independence delivered isolation for many. Men offered participation under fair terms and received contempt instead. Withdrawal followed as the logical next step. Economic pressure accelerates the timeline toward reckoning. 2026 tests who prepared and who assumed endless buffers. The sobering wake up is that reality does not care about narratives. It enforces limits through practical outcomes. Loneliness, poverty, health struggles without support, these are not abstract. They are daily experiences for growing numbers who bet against traditional structures. Men found peace in solitude or selective pairing because the alternative offered endless downside. Foreign cultures providing feminine, cooperative partners highlight what was lost domestically through cultural shifts. The contrast drives more to explore those options. Domestic women crying for rescue after pushing men away discover the door does not reopen easily. Trust eroded over years does not restore on demand. The word no from men carries the weight of accumulated experience. This sets the stage for deeper exploration of how the crisis developed, specific examples from both China and the US, the role of social media in amplifying both the loneliness and the backlash, economic forecasts intersecting with gender trends, and the long-term societal implications if disengagement continues. The full picture requires laying out each layer without compression because the truth demands thorough examination, and the economic pressures mounting toward 2026 are exposing the cracks in the independence model that many women embraced without building solid backups. Reports from financial analysts and health organizations show that affordability issues are forcing large numbers of adults to skip social events, family gatherings, and even basic outings because costs have climbed faster than incomes for many households. In the United States, surveys indicate that two-thirds of people have cut back on dinners with friends or holiday plans simply to stretch their budgets. And this withdrawal deepens the sense of isolation that was already spreading. Loneliness is not just an emotional state here. It ties directly to poorer health outcomes, higher medical expenses, and reduced productivity that ripples through the wider economy. When people live alone without partners or children to share burdens, small financial hits become major setbacks, and health problems that require assistance turn into crises handled in silence. Data from recent studies on adults over 45 reveal that 4 in 10 now report feeling lonely, with rates climbing noticeably since earlier measurements, and the group in their 40s and 50s faces extra strain from work demands, caregiving for parents, and shifting family structures that leave fewer people in their immediate circle. In China, the situation carries its own unique weight because of the long term effects of past population policies that created the 4-2-1 family model. One adult child often shoulders responsibility for two parents and four grandparents, but when that child remains single and childless, the support chain weakens dramatically as those older relatives age into needing more care. Urban areas see millions of professional women who focused on careers and delayed marriage now confronting the reality that their social networks have thinned while living costs continue to rise. Projections suggest that the number of people living solo could reach 150 to 200 million by 2030, and many of those will be women hitting middle age without the traditional family safety net that previous generations relied upon. Elderly loneliness is already documented at significant levels, with research showing around one quarter of older adults experiencing it to varying degrees. And the pattern accelerates when adult children live far away for work or choose not to form their own families. The combination of rapid modernization, high pressure urban living, and cultural expectations that once emphasized early marriage creates a mismatch where personal achievement coexists with later life vulnerability that feels stark when health or finances falter. Men observing these trends from a distance have accelerated their own strategic shifts. Recent surveys of American men traveling to countries like Colombia, the Philippines, and Thailand for dating report that 68% feel more respected in those relationships than they experienced back home. They describe dynamics where traditional roles allow them to provide while receiving cooperation and appreciation that contrasts sharply with the constant negotiation or public criticism encountered in Western contexts. This passport approach is not casual travel for short term encounters. It reflects deliberate choices by men who have remote work options or digital income streams that let their earnings stretch further abroad, enabling stable single income households in places where feminine traits pair with practical homemaking and family focus. Economists note that the rise of singlehood is reshaping societies in both positive and challenging ways. But for men tired of domestic dating markets that feel broken by mismatched expectations, the overseas path restores a sense of balance and purpose. They build lives with partners who view partnership as teamwork rather than competition. And the lower cost of living provides breathing room that tight Western economies often deny. The dating recession hitting young adults adds another layer to the overall picture. National surveys show that many in their prime years are simply not dating much, citing barriers like financial stress, lack of confidence in social skills, and a general exhaustion with modern interaction patterns that prioritize short term validation over long term commitment. This slowdown in relationship formation feeds directly into lower marriage and birth rates, which in turn accelerates the aging of populations and strain systems designed around family units. In the United States, the proportion of adults aged 25 to 34 living without a spouse or partner has doubled over 5 decades, reaching 50% for men and 41% for women, and the trend shows no immediate reversal. Young, educated women in particular report high levels of connection through digital means, yet still experience elevated loneliness because those interactions often lack the depth that comes from shared daily life and mutual support. The affordability crisis compounds this by making even basic social maintenance expensive. So people retreat further into solo routines that feel safer but leave emotional needs unmet. What stands out in the raw data is how single women without children in middle age face distinct vulnerabilities, even when some metrics, like earnings for working women without kids, appear higher in certain brackets. Broader studies on Americans 50 and older without children show that while some subgroups build strong wealth through career focus, others, especially unmarried individuals, encounter higher poverty risks later because there is no second income or family network to buffer downturns. Over 22 million older Americans now live alone without spouses or adult children, and this group reports greater anxiety around rising costs and health needs that require practical help. In China, similar pressures emerge as the one child generation reaches the point where their own parents and grandparents need support, but without siblings to share the load or their own offspring to continue the chain, the isolation becomes tangible. Women who once celebrated smashing old norms around marriage now encounter the practical limits when hospitals or daily expenses demand more than one person can sustainably manage alone. Men who have walked away describe the decision as liberating rather than bitter. After years of patterns where efforts in relationships met with diminishing returns or outright hostility, they redirect energy into personal development, skill building, or exploring environments where reciprocity feels natural. The black pill lens that some adopt comes from accumulated observations across thousands of individual cases rather than abstract theory. They see consistent outcomes where certain behaviors lead to conflict, false narratives, or legal imbalances that favor one side, and they choose self protection over repeated exposure. This is not blanket condemnation, it is pattern recognition that informs boundary setting and selective engagement. In 2026, as economic forecasts warn of potential disruptions in credit markets, employment, and supply chains, those who prepared through frugality and diversified options position themselves better to weather the storm while others scramble for external rescue that may not arrive as reliably as before. The storytelling aspect of the shift reveals itself in the quiet accumulation of choices rather than dramatic single events. Picture a generation of women who absorbed messages that career should come first and that marriage or children could wait indefinitely. They invested in education and professional paths that delivered independence and status in their 20s and 30s. But as 40s approached, the social fabric around them had changed. Friends paired off or moved for opportunities, leaving smaller circles. Parents aged and required more attention without shared siblings to divide the responsibility. Health issues that once seemed distant became immediate concerns handled through appointments booked between work shifts with no partner waiting at home to help with recovery. The viral clips showing emotional breakdowns capture genuine human pain from these accumulated gaps. Yet they also highlight how the earlier cultural celebration of solo success left little room for honest discussion of trade offs until the consequences landed. On the male side, the narrative unfolds as a measured retreat followed by strategic rebuilding. Regular guys who once tried to navigate the domestic landscape by being providers and absorbers of criticism reach saturation points after repeated cycles of the disrespect or one sided demands. They watched as public discourse continued to frame men as default problems while expecting them to maintain the systems that provided stability. Instead of arguing endlessly, they simply reduced participation. Some focused on fitness and hobbies that brought personal satisfaction without external drama. Others built businesses or side incomes that allowed geographic flexibility. The ones heading overseas often cite the relief of relationships where feminine energy complements rather than challenges, where daily life involves cooperation on home and future building instead of scorekeeping. Surveys confirming higher respect levels abroad underscore that this is about compatible dynamics rather than dominance. Men report lower stress and clearer futures when the partnership aligns on basic roles of provision and appreciation. Economic loneliness ties these threads together in ways that policymakers struggle to address because the roots run deep into incentives and cultural assumptions. When two-thirds of adults skip social connections due to cost, the isolation compounds health risks that drive up public expenses for everything from mental health services to chronic disease management. Loneliness correlates with higher chances of depression, weakened immune function, and even mortality rates comparable to major risk factors like smoking. In regions with high singlehood, the economic drag shows up as reduced innovation from fewer bridging connections, lower workforce engagement from absenteeism tied to emotional strain, and shifted consumer patterns towards solo living arrangements that demand different infrastructure. China faces its own version where the companionship economy has grown into a multi-billion yuan sector as people pay for temporary company to fill voids left by declining deep relationships. The United States sees parallel trends with digital solutions and delivery services enabling isolated living that feels convenient until crises hit. The sobering reality is that these patterns did not emerge overnight. They built from decades of policy, media, and educational emphasis on individual maximization over family interdependence. Women gained legal and economic ground that previous generations could only imagine, yet the relational costs surfaced gradually as marriage rates fell. Birth numbers dropped below replacement and support networks frayed. Men adapted by conserving their most valuable resources of time and commitment for situations offering mutual benefit. The word no that more men are comfortable using extends beyond dating into broader societal expectations. No to shouldering disproportionate risks without corresponding respect. No to funding systems that treat them as perpetual villains while demanding their participation as saviors. This boundary creates space for personal peace but leaves gaps in the collective structures that once relied on broad male investment. As hard times approach, the test becomes who built real resilience versus who counted on assumptions that no longer hold. Women facing middle age with limited networks discover that career achievements do not automatically translate into caregiving support or financial buffers against inflation in housing and healthcare. Men who planned ahead through savings, skill diversification, or international options navigate with fewer illusions about external rescue. The overseas marriages that result often succeed because both parties enter with aligned goals of family stability and complementary roles rather than competing ideologies. Foreign women from cultures that still emphasize feminine cooperation and homemaking bring traits that feel refreshing against domestic backdrops of entitlement or combativeness. This contrast drives continued exploration of those paths and contributes to thinner domestic dating pools where remaining participants face heightened tensions. The black pill perspective gains traction not from ideology, but from cold assessment of repeated outcomes. When pattern after pattern shows certain approaches leading to conflict, eroded trust, or practical disadvantage, rational observers adjust expectations downward. The victim narrative that provided cover for unaccountable actions loses effectiveness when economic pressures force accountability to the forefront. Those who position themselves as needing protection after contributing to conditions requiring protection encounter a landscape where automatic male response or institutional backup has weakened. The fury held in check for years redirects into disengagement that starves systems of willing contributors and relationships of willing participants. Societies feel the absence through slower family formation, strained elder care, and redirected innovation toward individual rather than collective advancement. This rebalancing carries implications that extend hundreds of years if cooperation continues to erode. Legal advancements for women depended on stable societies where men participated in provision and protection without constant resentment. When that participation drops, the foundation supporting progress weaken, potentially leading to harsher living standards where autonomy reveals its limits without interdependence. Earlier generations of women operated within frameworks that built resilience through family ties, even during scarcity. Modern shifts discarded those for untested ideals of total self sufficiency, leaving gaps that rhetoric cannot close when reality demands practical solutions. The can of worms involves not only personal stories of regret, but societal level adjustments that could reset gender expectations for generations. Men saying no in increasing numbers marks a firm boundary after prolonged imbalance. It is not immaturity, but recognition that endless giving without reciprocity leads to self erosion. In 2026, the economic headwinds make that boundary even clearer because survival requires prioritizing self and chosen circles over abstract contracts that stopped delivering. The confrontation brewing for decades manifests through mass opting out rather than organized pushback. Birth rates stay low, marriage pools shrink, and men redirect energy to domains offering clearer returns. Without steady buffers, the dynamic moves toward raw outcomes where actions determine results directly instead of filtered through excuses or external shields. The pitiful aspect lies in the preventable nature of much of the current isolation. Data on rising singlehood, loneliness spikes in middle age, and financial vulnerability among those without partners existed for years, yet dominant responses often double down on the same messages instead of encouraging balanced planning. Women who bet on career and delay without alternative supports now face the bill when external conditions tighten. Men who witnessed the mismatch chose paths protecting their futures through solitude, male friendships, or compatible pairings abroad. The overseas trend highlights what domestic culture lost when emphasis shifted from cooperation to competition. Peace in those matches comes from aligned values where provision meets appreciation and feminine traits enhance rather than undermine daily life. Economic forecasts for 2026 warn of tighter conditions that will test these divergences further. Scarcity sharpens priorities and exposes assumptions. Men focused on self reliance move with preparation. Women who invested heavily in independence without robust networks confront limits that ideology cannot erase. The reservoir of frustration from years of demonization informs disengagement that leaves systems under supported. When protections fade, accountability arrives in practical form where deflection meets direct consequences. The era of one sided conditioning reaches its natural endpoint as reality enforces balance through lived outcomes rather than enforced narratives. Loneliness statistics across countries paint a consistent picture of disconnection that economic strain amplifies. In the United States, nearly half of young adults in some studies report feeling isolated, with women in educated cohorts experiencing both high connection via work or digital means and high emotional voids from lack of deep bonds. China sees its solo living population surging with projections toward 30% of the total, driven by urbanization, work migration, and shifting priorities that leave fewer forming families. The companionship economy, filling some gaps, underscores the depth of the need, but also its commercial limits because paid interactions cannot replace organic mutual support built over time. Health organizations link these trends to increased risks of premature death, higher healthcare burdens, and reduced economic dynamism as isolated individuals contribute less to innovation and community resilience. The rhetorical pacing of this development feels like a slow burn toward unavoidable reckoning. Messages promising liberation through independence delivered widespread solo living for many women hitting middle age. Men offered engagement under fair terms and received framing as obstacles instead. Withdrawal followed as the rational response when costs outweighed benefits. Economic pressure accelerates the timeline by removing cushions that allowed imbalances to persist. The word no from men carries weight of experience accumulated across workplaces, relationships, and public discourse. Trust broken over decades does not restore on command when circumstances shift. The black pill conclusion that inherent behavioral differences make broad harmony difficult. Under current incentives, gains adherence because daily evidence accumulates without counterexamples strong enough to shift the pattern. Women in China navigating the leftover label or facing hospital rooms alone illustrate the human cost of delayed family formation in a culture with strong traditional undercurrents now clashing with modern ambitions. American women in their 40s and beyond reporting higher isolation when unmarried and childless show parallel outcomes where career gains coexist with support gaps that widen during illness or financial dips. Men planning for their own later years through savings and health routines avoid the expectation trap by witnessing its fragility elsewhere. Passport choices reflect practical calculation that certain cultures still produce partners oriented toward building rather than deconstructing. The fit, friendly, and family focused traits stand out because they align with long term stability instead of short term validation. This truthful accounting without filters reveals the core mechanism at work. Societies experimented with redefining gender roles and incentives, and the results are now measurable in loneliness rates, marriage declines, birth shortfalls, and diverging life strategies between men and women. The crisis of female loneliness stems from choices amplified by cultural forces that minimize trade offs until consequences became unavoidable. Men walking away represents adaptation to those forces through boundary enforcement and resource redirection. The downfall narrative is observation of predictable outcomes when human nature collides with mismatched incentives rather than any celebration of suffering. Winter brings tests for mindsets ignoring practical realities, and many will discover preparations fell short of the demands reality imposes. The intensity here comes from the collision of long term social experiments with immediate economic warnings. 2026 stands as convergence point where pressures meet. Men conserving energy for personal domains navigate with fewer illusions. Women facing solo middle age encounter a landscape where automatic support no longer applies as default. Pent up frustration from being cast as villains while expected to perform redirects into disengagement that reshapes participation levels. The sobering wake up call is that narratives do not override biology, economics, or the need for reciprocal relationships. Isolation, financial strain, health challenges without assistance. These become daily realities for growing numbers who bet against structures that provided resilience for prior generations. Men found peace through deliberate choices because alternatives offered repeated downside with little upside. Foreign pairings succeed where domestic ones faltered because cultural foundations emphasize duty and complementarity over negotiation. The contrast drives more exploration and contributes to domestic thinning. Cries for rescue after earlier push away meet closed doors built from eroded trust. The word no gains volume as experience accumulates. This sets stages for further layers, including specific regional data contrasts, the intersection of technology enabling solo living while worsening emotional voids, detailed economic modeling of singlehood impacts, and long term projections if trends hold without correction. The full examination requires thorough laying out of each element because truth demands depth over slogans. Economic loneliness links directly to productivity losses estimated in hundreds of billions annually across major economies from absenteeism, reduced engagement, and healthcare burdens. In the UK alone, figures point to billions lost yearly from loneliness related workplace effects, and United States estimates reach 400 billion, equivalent to notable recession impacts. These are not abstract. They translate to strained public budgets, slower growth in lonelier regions, and underutilized human capital when isolation inhibits information flow and entrepreneurial connections. China faces amplified versions through its demographic compression, where fewer young adults support more elders, and single living surges leave gaps in traditional caregiving that no policy has fully bridged yet. The storytelling continues through the lens of observable shifts in daily life. A professional woman in an American city builds a strong resume and network in her 30s, only to find in her 40s that close friends have families occupying their time. Parents need increasing help without shared load, and dating options narrow as men opt for lower drama paths or abroad. Health scares arrive with no built in support for recovery days or appointment transport, turning manageable issues into sources of panic. In Chinese urban centers, educated single women contribute heavily to growth yet face cultural pressure around age 27 and beyond, with the leftover label stinging even as they achieve independence that earlier generations lacked. When solo living becomes norm, the convenience of delivery and digital entertainment masks the accumulating void until a crisis forces confrontation with the lack of human buffers. Men in parallel build narratives of quiet competence. The engineer who simplifies life to focus on mastery avoids entanglements that previously drained resources without return. The remote worker who relocates temporarily or permanently discovers partners who value stability and bring cooperative energy that restores motivation for provision. Surveys of these men consistently highlight respect and lower conflict as key draws, allowing focus on future building rather than defense against criticism. This adaptation is rational response to environments where participation carried high risk of false claims, exaggerated disputes, or casual boundary violations met with expectations of silent absorption. The collective male exit is not coordinated campaign, but organic convergence on self-preservation after patterns repeated too often to ignore. As 2026 unfolds with its forecasted challenges, the divergence sharpens. Those who prepared through realistic assessment of trade offs position with advantage. Those who leaned on assumptions of endless external support or automatic rescue face exposed vulnerabilities. The reservoir of male restraint built under social and legal pressure shows signs of redirection when those pressures ease under fiscal strain. Simp enabled dynamics that propped up imbalances prove fragile when approval incentives shift or resources tighten. Victim claims lose traction when patterns of behavior reveal consistent contributions to chaos rather than pure external causation. Ruthless pattern recognition treats repeated actions as character indicators rather than exceptions excused by narrative. The can of worms opened involves potential rollback of autonomy gains if societal cooperation phrased to medieval levels where raw strength and provision dictate terms again. Grandmothers navigated harsher eras with family interdependence that buffered scarcity. Modern losses in well being traced to discarding those for maximization without safety nets. Legal progression assumed willing male participation that erodes when incentives misalign. The black pill view solidifies for many because evidence from loneliness data, marriage stats, and relationship outcomes points to fundamental mismatches amplified by current conditions rather than fixable through better messaging alone. Men adjust by conserving or selecting environments with better compatibility, leaving domestic scenes more contentious for those remaining. This raw authoritative take cuts through spin by focusing on measurable trends and human incentives. Female loneliness as crisis arises from the gap between promised self sufficiency and practical human limits. Men walking away en masse reflects calculated disengagement from unrewarding dynamics. The pitiful element is the unnecessary scale of suffering that clearer, earlier recognition of trade offs might have mitigated. Hard times test every foundation, and the coming period will separate preparation from presumption. The confrontation manifests in diverging life paths rather than direct clash, reshaping participation and expectations in ways that future generations will inherit. The word no becomes louder as experience cements boundaries, and peace in solitude or selective pairing abroad offers alternatives to endless cycles of disappointment. Economic modeling shows loneliness dragging growth through multiple channels. Reduced job performance from isolated workers, higher absenteeism, disrupted social capital that slows idea flow, and its elevated healthcare costs all compound into measurable GDP impacts. In lonelier regions, per capita growth lags as bridging connections weaken and human capital underperforms. The companionship economy in China, reaching tens of billions in value, signals deep unmet needs that commercial fixes only partially address because they lack the reciprocity and longevity of organic bonds. In the United States, financial FOMO from affordability pressures leads to skipped events that deepen isolation, creating feedback loops where emotional strain further hampers earning potential and social maintenance. The intensity builds as these forces converge. Women in middle age confronting solo challenges discover independence has hard edges when support networks fail to materialize. Men who walked early avoid those edges by building alternative structures. The sobering call is to recognize that reality enforces balance through outcomes, not wishes. Narratives crumble when lived experience contradicts them at scale. Loneliness, poverty risks, health isolation. These are not theoretical warnings, but current realities for millions navigating the results of decades long shifts. Men found peace by aligning actions with observed incentives. The contrast with domestic regret stories underscores the cost of mismatched cultural programming. This continues the thorough examination by weaving data, trends, and human scale impacts into a continuous narrative of how the crisis developed and where it heads without repetition or compression. The full depth requires exploring intersections with technology, policy responses, cultural backlash, and long arc projections for societal rebalancing if disengagement persists. The technological and social media landscape has accelerated the visibility of these diverging paths in ways that make the underlying tensions impossible to ignore for anyone paying attention. Platforms flood with short clips of women in their 30s and 40s describing the slow realization that their carefully built careers and independent routines leave them handling medical appointments, financial shortfalls, and emotional lows without the backup that family units once provided automatically. In China, the pressure feels particularly acute because rapid urbanization pulled young professionals into high intensity work environments where personal time shrank and marriage got postponed as a practical matter rather than a deliberate rejection. Now, those same women reach ages where health concerns or parental caregiving demands surface, and the absence of a stable partner turns routine challenges into isolating ordeals. Friendships that once felt solid drift apart when life stages split, with married acquaintances shifting focus to family obligations that leave little room for the deep one on one connection single women once relied upon for support. The result is a pattern where self sufficiency that worked in younger years starts to feel like a quiet erosion of the capacity for vulnerability and mutual reliance that humans need during tougher stretches. Men have leveraged the same digital tools and remote work opportunities to explore alternatives that restore a sense of equilibrium. The passport approach gains momentum because affordable travel and online communication make it straightforward to connect with women from cultures where partnership still centers on cooperation and appreciation for stable provision. In places like parts of Southeast Asia or Latin America, men report finding partners who approach daily life with friendliness and practicality that contrast with the testing and public framing encountered back home. These relationships often allow a single income to cover comfortable living because local costs remain lower, while the dynamic emphasizes building a shared future rather than ongoing defense against criticism. Surveys tracking this trend show increasing numbers of men citing higher levels of respect and lower conflict as primary reasons for committing abroad after experiencing domestic patterns that felt draining. It is a calculated move rooted in observed realities where certain environments reward masculine traits of protection and leadership with reciprocity instead of suspicion or mockery. The engineer who sold his assets to live remotely in a cabin represents one extreme of full disengagement, but many others simply redirect their efforts towards settings where their contributions feel valued rather than taken for granted or weaponized. Economic forecasts for the coming period add urgency to these personal strategies because tighter conditions test every assumption about self reliance. Analysts point to potential slowdowns in certain sectors, rising costs for essentials, and shifts in job markets that hit single individuals harder when there is no second earner to buffer volatility. In the United States, data on adults aged 45 and older shows loneliness rates climbing to around 40%, with particular vulnerability in the 40s and 50s due to work stress, caregiving loads, and changing family structures. Men in that group now report slightly higher loneliness than women in some recent polls, but many have responded by focusing inward on fitness, skills, or side ventures that provide control over their circumstances. Women facing similar pressures without partners encounter amplified risks because solo living leaves less margin when health or income dips. The companionship economy that has grown in China to tens of billions in value illustrates the scale of the void as people pay for temporary interactions to fill gaps left by declining organic bonds. Virtual chats, paid shopping companions, or short term social arrangements offer convenience, but cannot replicate the depth of long term mutual support that comes from committed relationships or family networks. The black pill perspective that resonates with more men stems from straightforward pattern recognition across these trends rather than emotional reaction. When large numbers of interactions follow similar scripts of initial attraction, followed by boundary testing, public complaints, or leverage through social or legal channels, observers draw logical conclusions about compatibility under current cultural conditions. This does not mean, every individual fits the pattern, but the consistency across thousands of documented cases informs risk assessment and boundary enforcement. Men who adopt this lens often prioritize solitude or highly selective pairing because the downside of mismatched dynamics has proven too costly in time, resources, and peace of mind. The word no becomes a practical tool for preserving energy for domains that deliver clearer returns, such as personal mastery, male friendships centered on shared goals, or international options where values align on family stability and complementary roles. In 2026, as economic headwinds potentially intensify, the incentive to conserve and redirect grows stronger because survival favors those who avoided overextension in unrewarding areas. Consider the human scale of friendship erosion that compounds loneliness when life paths diverge sharply. In many accounts, women describe how close bonds with other single friends weakened once some married and had children because conversations shifted, availability decreased, and gatherings revolved around family logistics rather than equal footing. The unmarried friend often feels like an outsider when topics center on childcare or spousal dynamics and practical help, flows in directions that leave solo individuals on the periphery. Over time, these drifts create smaller circles where deep emotional support becomes scarce, exactly when middle age brings new pressures like parental health needs or personal medical issues. In China, the 4-2-1 structure exacerbates this because one adult frequently shoulders multiple generations without siblings to share the load and without their own children to extend the support chain into the future. Urban single professionals who thrived on career momentum in their 20s find the pace less forgiving when energy levels or health require assistance that is not readily available from thinned social networks. On the male side, the narrative of strategic retreat includes building alternative structures that provide fulfillment without the relational overhead that once dominated life planning. Fitness communities, skill based hobbies, entrepreneurial ventures, and selective international connections allow men to channel energy productively while maintaining control over their environment. The rise in remote work has been a game changer here because it decouples income from geographic limitations and opens doors to lower cost locations where traditional partnership dynamics still emphasize cooperation. Men who make these moves often describe reduced stress and renewed motivation because the daily interactions feel reciprocal rather than adversarial. Foreign women raised in cultures that value feminine presentation, alongside practical homemaking and family orientation, bring energy that complements provision without the overlay of constant negotiation or score settling. This alignment restores a sense of purpose that many found missing in domestic settings, where messages framed male traits as problems to be managed rather than assets to be appreciated. The intersection with broader societal functions reveals deeper implications that extend beyond individual choices. Societies have historically relied on broad male participation in infrastructure, protection, innovation, and family formation to maintain stability and growth. When large cohorts disengage because the incentives no longer align with observed costs, the effects compound over time. Marriage rates and birth numbers stay below replacement levels, which accelerates population aging and strains systems built around family based caregiving and consumption patterns. Military and dangerous job recruitment faces challenges when young men see limited upside in committing to roles that demand high effort amid cultural framing that questions their contributions. Innovation in certain fields slows when risk taking and competitive drive get redirected toward personal domains rather than collective advancement. These are not sudden collapses, but gradual shifts that become noticeable when economic pressures highlight the gaps left by reduced participation. Data from recent international studies underscores the scale. Across multiple countries, nearly 4 in 10 adults report loneliness, with rates approaching 1 in 2 among those aged 18 to 24. Women in educated cohorts sometimes experience both high digital connectivity through work and social platforms and high emotional voids because those interactions lack the sustained depth of in person mutual reliance. In the United States, projections suggest that by 2030, around 45% of women aged 25 to 44 could be single, which represents a historic high and carries implications for long term well being when support networks remain thin. China faces its own demographic compression, where solo living is projected to rise significantly with the companionship economy expanding to meet unmet needs through commercial rather than organic means. These trends are not abstract statistics. They translate into real human experiences of handling crises alone, facing financial strain without shared buffers, and confronting health challenges without built in assistance. The sobering element is how cultural messaging for decades emphasized individual maximization while downplaying the practical trade offs of delaying or foregoing family formation. Women gain measurable advances in education, earnings, and legal autonomy that open doors previous generations could not access, yet the relational and support side effects surfaced gradually as social circles thinned and external systems faced their own limits. Men adapted by enforcing boundaries after patterns of disrespect, false narratives, or one sided expectations eroded trust. The restraint that civilization depends upon is not weakness or inability, but a deliberate choice rooted in discipline and long term thinking. When that restraint gets tested repeatedly through provocation, humiliation, or exploitation without reciprocity, the logical response is withdrawal to protect peace and resources. Biology has not changed despite social narratives claiming near identical capabilities across sexes. Men, on average, retain physical advantages in strength and reflexes that historically shaped protective roles. And when cultural conditions ignore those realities while demanding continued provision, the mismatch breeds disengagement. In the context of approaching economic tightness, the divergence between prepared self reliance and assumed external support becomes sharper. Forecasts vary, but many point to potential volatility in employment, inflation pressures on essentials, and fiscal strains that reduce the reliability of safety nets many took for granted. Single women without children or strong family ties face elevated risks in such environments because there is no second income or shared caregiving to distribute loads. Men who built savings, diversified skills, or established portable income streams navigate with greater control because they avoided over reliance on dynamics that offered uncertain returns. The overseas route provides additional leverage for those with flexibility because currency strength or lower living costs allow stable households on single earnings, while cultural compatibility reduces daily friction. These choices are not driven by rejection of responsibility, but by realistic assessment that certain domestic conditions no longer reward the traditional provider role with corresponding stability or appreciation. The black pill lens solidifies further when data on loneliness, marriage decline, and relationship outcomes accumulate without strong counter trends. Pattern recognition treats repeated behaviors as indicators of likely future results rather than hoping for exceptions at personal expense. Men who reach this assessment often choose solitude, where they control their environment, or selective pairing, where values align on cooperation and long term building. The word no extends to societal expectations that demand male participation while framing contributions as suspect or toxic. In 2026, this boundary setting gains practical weight because scarcity favors those who conserved rather than those who extended trust repeatedly only to encounter the same cycles. The reservoir of frustration from years of being positioned as default villains while expected to absorb costs and criticism redirects into disengagement that leaves systems undersupported and relationships underformed. This rebalancing carries long arc consequences for legal and social advancements that assumed stable cooperation across groups. Autonomy gains for women relied on societies where men willingly provided and protected amid mutual respect. When that willingness erodes due to mismatched incentives, the foundations supporting progress can weaken, leading to harsher practical realities where raw capability and interdependence dictate terms more directly. Earlier generations of women often operated within cultural frameworks that built resilience through family ties, even during periods of scarcity or uncertainty. Modern emphasis on total self sufficiency discarded many of those mechanisms in favor of untested ideals, leaving gaps that become evident when external conditions tighten. The can of worms involves potential societal adjustments that could reset expectations around gender roles and support structures for decades if current trajectories hold. Stories from hospital rooms or quiet apartments illustrate the human cost without needing exaggeration. A woman in middle age confronts a medical issue alone, realizing that friends have dispersed to their own family obligations and there is no partner to assist with recovery or logistics. In China, the weight of supporting aging parents without siblings or offspring amplifies the isolation when work demands or health limits capacity. Similar patterns appear in Western data, where unmarried adults in their 40s and beyond report higher stress around financial security and caregiving without the buffers that coupled households provide. Men who witnessed these outcomes in real time or through shared accounts chose paths that minimize their exposure to similar vulnerabilities. Some embraced full solitude with remote living and self directed routines. Others invested in communities of like minded men focused on competence and mutual encouragement. The passport trend reflects another layer where practical calculation meets cultural contrast, offering dynamics that feel restorative rather than depleting. The intensity of the current moment stems from the collision of accumulated social experiments with immediate economic and demographic realities. 2026 serves as a convergence where forecasts of tighter conditions meet the visible effects of mass disengagement. Men conserving energy for personal domains or compatible international pairings move with fewer illusions about automatic reciprocity. Women navigating solo middle age encounter landscapes where support is no longer default and must be built deliberately rather than assumed. The pent up effects of one sided conditioning do not require dramatic confrontation to reshape participation. Quiet withdrawal achieves disruption by reducing buy in to structures that stopped delivering balanced returns. The sobering truth is that human nature enforces limits through lived outcomes, regardless of how compelling the narrative sounded in earlier decades. Loneliness, financial exposure, health challenges without assistance, these become concrete tests that separate preparation from presumption. Economic modeling of singlehood impacts shows drag on growth through several channels. Isolated individuals contribute less to social capital that facilitates idea exchange and opportunity creation. Workplace absenteeism and reduced engagement tied to emotional strain add up to substantial productivity losses estimated in hundreds of billions across major economies. Healthcare burdens rise when loneliness correlates with higher risks of chronic conditions, depression, and weakened resilience. In China, the companionship economy filling voids through paid interactions highlights both the depth of need and its commercial boundaries because temporary arrangements lack the longevity and reciprocity of committed bonds. In the United States, affordability pressures lead to skipped social maintenance, which deepens isolation in feedback loops that further limit earning potential and network building. These effects compound when birth rates remain low and aging populations increase dependency ratios without sufficient family based caregiving to offset public system strains. The rhetorical flow of this development unfolds as a measured accounting of incentives and consequences rather than sudden reversal. Messages that celebrated independence as unalloyed freedom delivered measurable gains in individual metrics for many women, yet left relational voids that widen under pressure. Men offered engagement on terms of mutual respect and received framing that questioned their core traits instead. Disengagement followed as the rational adaptation when repeated cycles offered diminishing returns. Economic tightness removes cushions that allowed imbalances to persist without immediate feedback. The word no from men carries the accumulated weight of experience in workplaces, dating markets, and public discourse where participation often meant absorbing criticism while performing regardless. Trust eroded gradually, does not rebuild instantly when circumstances change. The black pill assessment that behavioral and priority differences make broad harmony challenging under misaligned incentives gains traction because observable data from loneliness surveys, marriage statistics, and outcome patterns points consistently in that direction. Women in educated urban cohorts sometimes maintain high surface level connections through professional networks or digital platforms while experiencing elevated emotional isolation because those links rarely translate into practical daily support during crises. Young adults across countries report loneliness rates near 50%, with women in some studies noting higher friendship expectations that go unmet when life demands intensify. In China, the shift towards solo living and paid companionship reflects similar voids created by work migration, delayed family formation, and cultural transitions that compressed traditional support structures. Men who adapted early through self reliance or selective pairing avoid many of those voids by aligning actions with realistic assessments of compatibility and risk. The overseas dynamic succeeds in many cases because both parties enter with clear roles of provision, meeting cooperation, and feminine traits, enhancing rather than competing with masculine ones. This contrast drives continued interest and contributes to domestic pools feeling more strained for those who stay engaged locally. This truthful examination without filters lays out the mechanism at work. The crisis of isolation and vulnerability for many women in middle age arises from the gap between cultural promises of complete self sufficiency and the practical limits of human needs for connection and shared burden. Male disengagement represents adaptation to incentives that no longer rewarded traditional investment with balanced outcomes. The pitiful scale of preventable hardship comes from ignoring trade offs until consequences accumulated at population levels. Hard times ahead will test foundations built on assumptions versus those grounded in observed realities. The brewing rebalancing manifests through diverging life strategies that reshape societal participation without needing centralized direction. Men saying no enforces boundaries after prolonged imbalance, and peace in chosen paths offers alternatives to cycles that deliver disappointment. And the can of worms continues to unfold as societies grapple with the downstream effects of reduced family formation and thinned support networks. Legal and autonomy advancements assumed cooperative foundations that weaken when large groups redirect energy elsewhere. Potential fallback to more raw standards of living becomes possible if interdependence erodes without replacement structures. Grandmothers navigated different baselines that emphasized family resilience even in difficult eras. Modern losses in overall well being for segments of the population trace back to discarding those baselines for maximization without adequate safety nets. Pattern recognition among men leads to further selection of environments with better alignment, leaving domestic dynamics more contentious or sparse. The black pill conclusion solidifies for many because evidence from daily trends points to fundamental mismatches amplified by current conditions rather than surface level fixes. As economic pressures potentially mount the divergence between strategic preparation and reliance on fading assumptions grows starker. Men who focused on self protection through savings, skills, or geographic flexibility position with advantage in volatile times. Women who bet heavily on career independence without parallel investment in relational or financial buffers confront exposed limits that no amount of prior messaging can soften. The reservoir of restrained frustration from decades of demonization and one sided demands informs ongoing disengagement that leaves collective systems under contributed. When external protections like expansive state buffers or unconditional enabling weaken, accountability arrives through direct consequences where actions meet outcomes without filtered excuses. The era of victim status providing cover for patterns that contributed to chaos reaches natural limits as economic realities force harder choices and clearer assessments. The policy responses attempting to address rising singlehood and its ripple effects have largely fallen short because they treat symptoms like temporary companionship programs or awareness campaigns rather than the core mismatches in incentives and expectations that drive the divergence. In China, the companionship economy has ballooned into a massive sector where young adults pay for short term chats, shopping companions, or virtual interactions to ease the immediate sting of disconnection. Yet these arrangements end abruptly once the timer runs out, leaving the underlying need for sustained mutual reliance unmet. Similar dynamics appear in Western contexts through delivery services and digital entertainment that make solo living convenient on the surface, but erode the habits of building and maintaining deep bonds over years. Governments in both regions have floated ideas around elder care reforms or housing adjustments for single populations. But the deeper cultural shift toward prioritizing individual achievement over family interdependence resists quick fixes because it stems from decades of messaging that downplayed the practical value of long term commitment. When budgets tighten under economic forecasts, the limitations of these surface level interventions become clear as public systems cannot fully substitute for the organic support that committed partnerships and extended families once provided naturally. Biological realities add another layer of sobering perspective that cultural narratives have often glossed over in recent decades. Men, on average, possess greater upper body strength, denser bones, and faster reflexes shaped by evolutionary pressures that historically aligned with roles involving protection and physical competition. Civilization has thrived by channeling those traits into disciplined restraint rather than unchecked expression. Yet that restraint depends on mutual respect and reciprocal value within social structures. When provocation becomes normalized through casual aggression or public humiliation without corresponding accountability, the foundation for that restraint weakens because humans do not possess infinite tolerance regardless of social conditioning. Women initiating physical confrontations in domestic disputes or leveraging threats of institutional intervention have operated under the assumption that male response will remain contained indefinitely. But pattern recognition across countless documented cases shows that such assumptions carry risks when external controls like reliable enforcement or broad social approval start to fray under fiscal or cultural strain. This is not a prediction of widespread chaos, but a recognition that treating one group as inherently non threatening while excusing boundary violations from another eventually strains the social contract that keeps everyday interaction stable. The passport trend among Western men continues to expand as remote work and digital income streams allow greater geographic flexibility and economic leverage in lower cost environments. Men who relocate or travel to countries in Southeast Asia, Latin America, or Eastern Europe often cite the appeal of dynamics where feminine presentation pairs with practical cooperation on home life and future planning rather than constant testing or public score settling. Their Western salaries stretch further, enabling stable single income households that feel unattainable in high expense domestic markets, where dual incomes have become the default expectation amid rising costs. Surveys tracking these moves indicate that a significant portion report higher satisfaction from relationships emphasizing appreciation for provision and complementary roles instead of adversarial negotiation. Critics sometimes frame this as exploitation due to income gaps, but the men involved describe it as practical arbitrage, where both parties gain from an aligned values on family stability and daily teamwork that domestic dating frequently lacks after years of cultural emphasis on independence as the highest virtue. The trend gains visibility through online forums and content creators ranking locations based on perceived traditional traits, yet at its core, it reflects men voting with their feet after observing repeated patterns of diminished returns in home markets. Young, educated women in particular navigate a strange paradox where high levels of professional and digital connectivity coexist with elevated emotional voids because friendship expectations often center on deep one on one support that modern life schedules and diverging priorities make harder to sustain. Studies highlight that this group maintains extensive networks through work or platforms, yet reports feeling isolated when those connections remain surface level and fail to translate into practical assistance during health scares or financial pressures. In the United States, nearly a quarter of adults in their late teens and 20s describe frequent loneliness, with rates climbing among urban residents and those with lower income buffers. Similar patterns emerge internationally, where nearly 4 in 10 adults across multiple countries report disconnection, with young adults nearing 1 in 2. These figures are not mere feelings, but correlate with measurable health impacts, including higher risks of depression, anxiety, and even elevated mortality that add strain to already pressured healthcare systems. When singlehood projections point toward 45% of women aged 25 to 44 remaining single by 2030, the cumulative effect on population level well being becomes hard to dismiss as temporary or self inflicted because the support gaps widen precisely when middle age brings caregiving demands for aging parents or personal medical needs that one person handles alone. Men in the 45 plus range now report slightly higher loneliness rates than women in some recent polls, marking a shift from earlier parity and underscoring that disengagement brings its own emotional costs, even as it provides peace from prior dynamics. Many respond by doubling down on fitness routines, skill development, or male centered communities focused on competence and shared purpose rather than relational drama. The cabin dweller who simplified life after years of feeling treated as defective represents one visible example, but quieter versions play out through men, prioritizing portable careers or hobbies that restore control without external validation. This inward focus is not withdrawal from all responsibility, but redirection toward domains where effort yields predictable returns instead of endless criticism or risk of false narratives. In 2026, as potential economic volatility looms, the advantage goes to those who built buffers early through frugality and self reliance, because scarcity exposes vulnerabilities in solo setups that lack shared resources or caregiving reciprocity. The dating recession affecting prime age adults reveals itself through national surveys showing that many in their 20s and 30s simply are not dating much, citing barriers like financial stress, eroded social skills from digital heavy interactions, and general fatigue, with patterns that prioritize short term validation over commitment. Marriage and birth rates remain suppressed as a result, accelerating the aging of populations and increasing dependency ratios that public systems struggle to cover without robust family units. In the United States, the proportion of young adults living without a spouse or partner has doubled over 5 decades, reaching high levels for both sexes, and the trend shows persistence despite policy nudges towards social connection. The rise of singlehood reshapes economies in mixed ways, with some benefits in individual flexibility and consumer patterns, yet clear downsides in reduced innovation from fewer bridging ties and higher public costs from isolation related health burdens. When two-thirds of adults report cutting back on social activities due to affordability, the isolation compounds, creating feedback loops where emotional strain further limits earning potential and network maintenance. Friendship erosion follows predictable paths when life stages split sharply between those who form families and those who remain single. Married individuals with children often see their social energy shift toward family logistics, leaving less room for equal footing gatherings with unmarried friends whose topics and availability differ. Over time, conversations dwindle, gatherings become infrequent, and the silent drift solidifies without dramatic confrontation because both sides adapt to new priorities. In China, this dynamic intersects with the legacy of population policies creating compressed family structures where one adult shoulders multiple generations without siblings to distribute loads. Urban professionals who delayed family formation for career momentum now confront the reality that thin circles provide limited backup when health or parental needs intensify. The emotional numbing that long term singlehood can produce makes re entering relational spaces feel intrusive rather than welcome, because routines built around solitude become comfortable in their predictability, even as they limit vulnerability and mutual growth. The Black Pill assessment gains further adherence among men through cold evaluation of outcomes where certain cultural conditions amplify behavioral differences in priorities and risk tolerance. When pattern recognition from workplace interactions, dating experiences, and public discourse consistently shows one sided expectations, the logical response is lowered investment and heightened selectivity. This is not universal dismissal, but practical boundary setting to avoid repeated exposure to dynamics offering high downside with low reciprocity. Solitude provides control and peace for many, while selective international pairing offers compatibility in environments where cooperation on family roles remains valued. The word no serves as a tool for conserving resources in an era where societal demands continue to frame male contributions as obligatory despite eroded trust. Economic tightness in the coming period sharpens this calculus because survival favors preparation over extension of trust that history has shown to be unreliable under stress. Long term projections, if disengagement patterns hold, suggest potential rebalancing of gender expectations toward more pragmatic interdependence rather than idealized independence. Legal advancements assumed broad participation and cooperation that weaken when incentives misalign, leading to harsher practical limits on autonomy when support structures fray. Earlier generations often maintained resilience through family ties that buffered scarcity or uncertainty even without modern conveniences. Modern losses in well being for segments of the population trace to the discarding of those mechanisms in favor of maximization without adequate alternatives. When single living surges to projected high levels, the convenience of technology and services masks accumulating gaps until crises force confrontation with the limits of one person managing everything. Men who observed this early built alternative paths through self directed routines or compatible pairings abroad, where daily life feels lighter due to aligned roles of provision, meeting appreciation and feminine traits, enhancing rather than undermining stability. The companionship economy in China, reaching tens of billions, illustrates the depth of unmet needs for connection. Yet its commercial nature highlights boundaries because paid interactions lack the longevity and genuine reciprocity of organic bonds formed through shared life experiences. In Western contexts, similar reliance on delivery and entertainment enables isolated routines that feel efficient until health or financial pressures demand human assistance that is not on call. These trends intersect with broader societal functions where reduced family formation strains elder care systems and lowers the human capital available for collective advancement. Innovation slows when competitive drive redirects inward, and risk taking diminishes amid cultural framing that questions traditional masculine contributions. The sobering accounting is that human nature does not bend indefinitely to ideological preferences because practical outcomes enforce feedback regardless of how loudly narratives claim otherwise. Policy limitations become evident when attempts to boost social connection through campaigns or subsidies encounter resistance from deeply ingrained habits of digital isolation and individualism. Awareness of loneliness as a health risk equivalent to major factors has grown, yet translation into effective reversal of singlehood trends remains elusive because the root drivers involve mismatched expectations around respect, reciprocity, and long term planning. In 2020, six forecasts of tighter conditions will test these structures, further separating those who invested in realistic buffers from those who assumed endless external support. Men focusing on competence and self protection navigate with clearer agency, while women confronting solo middle age face exposed edges where career gains do not automatically cover caregiving or emotional voids. The passport dynamic expands the options for those with flexibility, highlighting cultural contrasts where traditional values on family still provide frameworks for mutual benefit that domestic shifts eroded over time. This raw examination of the mechanisms at play reveals how accumulated individual choices create population level shifts that no single intervention can fully unwind. The crisis of disconnection for many women stems from the gap between promised complete autonomy and the human requirement for shared burdens during inevitable tough periods. Male adaptation through boundary enforcement and resource redirection represents rational response to observed incentives rather than arbitrary retreat. The scale of hardship that could have been mitigated with earlier recognition of trade offs now manifests in measurable loneliness rates, suppressed family formation, and diverging life strategies. Hard economic realities ahead will sharpen the distinctions between preparation grounded in pattern recognition and presumption built on fading assumptions. The rebalancing unfolds through quiet decisions that reshape participation without centralized coordination, leaving societies to adjust to new baselines of interdependence or its absence. The storytelling of this era centers on the slow burn of incentives colliding with biology and economics. A young professional builds credentials and networks only to discover in later years that high connectivity does not guarantee practical support when life demands assistance beyond digital likes or surface conversations. In compressed demographic settings, the load of elder care falls heavily on fewer shoulders without the extension of family chains into the future. Men who witnessed the fragility of unconditional expectations chose simplification or relocation to restore balance where effort aligns with appreciation. The overseas success stories frequently emphasize reduced friction from complementary roles where provision meets cooperation, allowing focus on building rather than defending. This contrast drives sustained interest and contributes to domestic thinning, where remaining interactions carry heightened tension from mismatched priorities. Economic modeling continues to quantify the drag from isolation through channels like reduced social capital that slows opportunity creation, elevated healthcare burdens from correlated conditions, and productivity losses from emotional strain affecting engagement. When nearly half of young adults in international data report disconnection, the cumulative effect on growth and resilience becomes substantial, especially as aging populations increase dependency without sufficient family offsets. The word no from men enforces limits after prolonged imbalance, where participation meant absorbing costs while facing framing as inherent problems. Trust eroded through repeated cycles does not restore on demand when external conditions shift toward scarcity. The black pill view solidifies because observable patterns from surveys and outcomes point to fundamental differences in behavior under current cultural setups rather than superficial mismatches fixable through better communication alone. Women in urban educated groups sometimes experience the dual reality of professional achievement alongside emotional isolation when friendship expectations for depth go unmet amid busy schedules and diverging life paths. Young adults across regions face elevated rates, with women in some cohorts noting higher needs for connection that modern structures struggle to fulfill consistently. Men adapting through self reliance or selective environments avoid many pitfalls by aligning actions with realistic risk assessments. The passport route succeeds in numerous cases because both sides enter with clear expectations of stability and teamwork that reduce daily negotiation. This alignment restores motivation for long term planning that domestic backdrops often diminished through emphasis on competition over cooperation. The can of worms extends to potential adjustments in societal norms if cooperation continues to decline without replacement mechanisms. Autonomy that assumed willing cross group investment reveals vulnerabilities when that investment redirects elsewhere due to eroded reciprocity. Grandmothers and earlier lines maintained different baselines, emphasizing interdependence that provided buffers even in uncertain times. Modern segments showing losses in overall well being reflect the costs of shifting away from those baselines toward untested maximization. Pattern recognition leads men to further selectivity, leaving domestic scenes sparser or more strained for participants. The intensity builds as economic forecasts converge with demographic trends, forcing harder choices between realistic preparation and continued reliance on weakening assumptions. This truthful narrative without shortcuts lays out the intersecting forces of technology, policy, biology, economics, and culture creating the current landscape. Female disconnection in middle age arises from accumulated gaps in support that independence messaging minimized until consequences landed. Male disengagement reflects calculated conservation after patterns demonstrated poor returns. The pitiful preventable aspect lies in the scale of isolation that clear trade off discussions might have reduced. Winter, like pressures, test every foundation, and the coming convergence will highlight who built on solid incentives versus fleeting narratives. The word no gains volume as experience cements boundaries, and peace in aligned paths offers viable alternatives to unrewarding cycles. Societies will inherit the results of these divergences, reshaping expectations around roles and resilience for the long term. The full depth requires weaving in further intersections with cultural signals of backlash limitations of commercial fixes for human needs and extended modeling of impacts if singlehood and disengagement trajectories persist. The continuous flow of observable trends and human scale incentives demands thorough exploration to capture the authoritative reality of how this crisis developed and where the paths lead without illusion or repetition. The 1 Hour Gang who stuck it out all the way to the end, gets a straight up shout out because reaching this point means you face the raw truth without looking away. And that takes real guts when most people prefer comfortable stories over what the numbers and patterns actually show. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to keep the unfiltered straight talk coming, then show some support by buying me a Red Bull with a one-time gift or setting up a monthly pledge using the link in the description of the video. It helps keep everything honest and direct without pulling punches or softening the edges for anyone. What did you think about everything we laid out here today? Do you agree that the crisis of female loneliness has reached a point where the old assumptions no longer hold and the patterns of disengagement have become too consistent to ignore? Or do you see different angles that still point towards some path back to balance? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because the real conversation happens when people share what they see in their own lives and observations without the usual spin or deflection. Hearing from you helps sharpen the picture and shows where the wake-up call lands hardest. Like the video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe, and if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.